You woke up this morning and, without thinking too much about it, you made a series of decisions that felt entirely your own. You chose when to open your eyes. You chose which direction to turn in bed. You chose what to check first on your phone, which thought to follow, which memory to ignore, which version of yourself to bring into the day. It felt natural. If it felt voluntary. It felt like you were the author of these moments. And yet, beneath that feeling of authorship, something far stranger was already at work. Long before you experienced the sensation of deciding, your brain had already begun preparing the outcome. Networks of neurons were quietly weighing possibilities, predicting consequences, adjusting internal models of the world, all without your awareness. By the time you felt the thought, "I will do this," much of the work had already been done. The decision was not born in the moment you noticed it. It was revealed to you. This does not mean you are broken. It means you are biological. You are a living prediction machine, constantly generating expectations about what will happen next, and about who you are in the middle of it all. Your sense of choice, your feeling of agency, your experience of being a self that decides, is part of this prediction. It is one of the brain's most convincing stories. Not because it is useless, but because it is deeply efficient. It keeps you coherent. It keeps your actions aligned. It makes life navigable. The feeling of choice, of free will, is one of the most intimate and undeniable aspects of human experience. Every day, you feel as if you are making decisions, large and small, consciously directing your actions according to reason, preference, or desire. From deciding what to eat for breakfast, to the words you speak in conversation, to the career paths you pursue, the experience of choosing seems to flow seamlessly and immediately from your sense of self. It feels like there is a central agent inside your mind, a kind of internal executive who observes the world, weighs options, and selects a course of action. This experience is so compelling and so persistent that we rarely question it, and yet, the more we study the brain and consciousness, the more we discover that this sense of authorship is a remarkable construction, a narrative woven by neural processes, rather than a direct reflection of a freely acting will. To understand this, we must look carefully at how the brain generates the feeling of choice and why it feels so profoundly personal. The brain is a predictive organ. Its fundamental job is not simply to react to the world, but to anticipate it, to generate models of what is likely to happen next, and to guide behavior accordingly. These models are constantly updated based on incoming sensory information, memory, and internal states. When you feel that you are deciding between options, your brain is already engaged in an intricate process of predicting the consequences of different actions and evaluating which is most aligned with your goals, your prior experiences, and your expectations. The sensation of making a conscious choice emerges only after these internal processes have generated a preferred course of action. In other words, the brain does the work first, and the conscious mind experiences the outcome as if it was spontaneously chosen. Experiments in neuroscience have repeatedly shown this temporal sequence, where neural activity predicting a decision can be detected milliseconds or even seconds before the subject reports a conscious awareness of having made that choice, suggesting that the feeling of agency is a post hoc interpretation of brain activity rather than the initiating force itself. Despite this, the experience of choice is phenomenally real. You feel as if you are selecting among possibilities, deliberating over options, and making decisions that are genuinely your own. This is because the brain has evolved to provide this experience. It is adaptive for an organism to perceive itself as a coherent agent, capable of controlling its actions. A sense of agency allows for planning, for moral evaluation, for learning from mistakes, and for coordinating behavior over time in a complex social environment. It ensures that actions feel intentional, which in turn allows the organism to adjust behavior, seek rewards, and avoid harm. From an evolutionary perspective, it is not necessary that free will exist in some metaphysical sense. It is sufficient that the brain constructs a convincing experience of choice that supports adaptive behavior. The illusion is functional, deeply ingrained, and virtually indistinguishable from what we naturally interpret as genuine freedom of action. To examine this further, Consider the difference between experiencing a decision and understanding the underlying mechanisms of that decision. When you choose to lift your hand, you are immediately aware of the movement, the intention, and the action itself. You feel in control, as if the choice emanates directly from your conscious self. Yet studies using neuroimaging and electrophysiological recording have demonstrated that the neural networks involved in initiating that movement are active before you are consciously aware of deciding. The motor areas of the brain, the premotor cortex, and associated regions generate a cascade of activity that prepares and executes the movement in advance, while your conscious mind interprets this preparation as the moment of decision. The brain, in essence, has already committed to the action before you have the sense of committing. Your subjective experience lags behind the underlying processes. This reveals the striking difference between the narrative of choice and the computational reality of the brain, illustrating that the feeling of will is a carefully timed interpretation layered atop mechanistic processes. The implications of this distinction are profound. If the sense of choosing is a constructed experience, then that you, who feels like the author of decisions, is not the ultimate originator of action. Your conscious self does not command behavior in the way you might intuitively believe. Instead, it observes and interprets the outputs of complex neural dynamics. These outputs are shaped by prior experiences, learned habits, emotional states, and ongoing predictions about the world, creating a sophisticated system that generates behavior in a context-sensitive, adaptive manner. The sensation of choice is the interface between these processes and your conscious awareness, giving the impression that decisions spring forth from a freely acting mind, when in reality they emerge from a highly interconnected, probabilistic network of biological computations. The subjective experience of volition is inseparable from the mechanisms that produce it, yet it is also distinct, a narrative overlay that informs your perception of self and agency. Moreover, the feeling of choice is intimately tied to identity and self-concept. We do not merely act, we act as someone with preferences, beliefs, and intentions. The narrative of decision-making is interwoven with the story of who we are. When you feel that you are making a choice, you are also reinforcing the continuity of your identity, integrating the past, present, and projected future. This is why the illusion of free will feels so compelling and morally significant. The brain presents your actions as self-authored because this presentation is essential for coherent functioning. It supports learning by allowing you to attribute outcomes to yourself, to modify behavior based on consequences, and to interact socially in ways that presume responsibility and intentionality. Without the experience of agency, the coordination of complex behaviors, both individually and collectively, would be far less effective. Interestingly, the intensity of the feeling of choice varies depending on context and cognitive load. Simple or habitual actions often feel automatic, and the sense of deliberation may fade. Yet even in these cases, the brain is still generating predictions and preparing actions in advance. In more complex or ambiguous situations, the sensation of choice becomes more vivid, as the predictive machinery of the brain has to weigh multiple possible outcomes, and the conscious mind interprets this uncertainty as the exercise of free will. The brain's ability to simulate alternative scenarios, anticipate outcomes, and evaluate trade-offs contributes to the richness of the subjective experience of deciding. In this way, the intensity of the feeling of choice is directly linked to the computational effort required by the brain to resolve uncertainty, highlighting how perception and prediction are deeply intertwined. This understanding does not diminish personal experience, it reframes it. The feeling of choosing, the sensation of freedom, is not a mistake, but a window into the architecture of the mind. It reveals how the brain generates coherent behavior, how it integrates past experience with present stimuli, and how it maintains the continuity of self across time. By exploring the mechanisms behind this experience, we gain insight into the astonishing predictive power of the brain, the elegance of its design, and the way consciousness functions as both an interpreter and a participant in a dynamic, living system. The feeling of choice is not a simple reflection of reality. It is an emergent property of complex neural networks, a story the brain tells itself in order to navigate a world of uncertainty, risk, and possibility. When we acknowledge that the sense of choice is a construction rather than an independent originator, we begin to see human behavior through a different lens. Responsibility, morality, and personal growth are not negated by this realization. They are reframed within a richer understanding of how the mind works. Each decision you experience is the culmination of countless predictive computations, subtle biases, and contextual evaluations. Your consciousness experiences it as choice because the brain has evolved to make it feel that way, to provide a sense of agency that is functional, coherent, and deeply adaptive. The brain does not simply respond to the world as it unfolds, it actively anticipates it, constantly generating predictions about what is likely to happen next. Every moment of perception, every decision, and every action is underpinned by this predictive machinery, which operates largely beneath conscious awareness. When we think we are freely deciding, what is actually happening is that the brain has already begun the work of calculating probabilities, weighing outcomes, and preparing responses before we are aware of it. This predictive nature is not a quirk, but a fundamental feature of how the brain ensures survival and functionality in an inherently uncertain environment. Our senses do not passively record reality, they interact with internal models of the world, comparing expectation with input, updating predictions, and generating signals that guide behavior. It is within this context that our sense of choice arises, emerging as a subjective experience that aligns with the brain's anticipatory computations, creating the impression that we consciously command our actions rather than simply witnessing the outcomes of predictive processes. The predictive brain operates through hierarchical networks, each level generating expectations about the level below it. Sensory areas predict incoming signals, while higher order areas anticipate patterns, contexts, and the consequences of actions. When a prediction matches the sensory input, the brain's model is reinforced. When there is a mismatch, a prediction error occurs, prompting adjustments to the model. This cycle of prediction and error correction is continuous and dynamic, allowing the brain to fine-tune behavior in real time. The same mechanism that enables perception to feel seamless also underlies decision-making. By forecasting the likely results of different actions, the brain can select the most appropriate course without waiting for external events to dictate outcomes. Conscious awareness enters this process not as the originator, but as the interpreter, a stage on which the prepared predictions are experienced as voluntary choices. In this sense, what we call deciding is the conscious registration of a computation that has already been underway, often long before the moment we feel we are in control. Experimental evidence highlights the anticipatory nature of decision-making. Studies measuring brain activity have revealed that neural patterns can predict a person's choice several seconds before they report consciously deciding. For example, when a subject is asked to press one of two buttons at will, researchers can detect patterns in the brain that forecast which button will be pressed well in advance. The conscious awareness of deciding lags behind these neural precursors, suggesting that the sense of choice is an emergent property, a narrative imposed on a process that has already progressed toward a conclusion. These findings challenge the intuitive notion of a freely deciding self, illustrating that the mind experiences decisions as they are revealed rather than as they are initiated. The brain, through prediction, sets the stage for behavior, and consciousness follows, giving coherence and context to what has already been prepared. Prediction is not limited to motor actions or simple decisions. It permeates perception, emotion, and cognition. When you walk down a familiar street, you are constantly anticipating what you will see, hear, and feel. Your brain forecasts the trajectory of moving objects, the locations of familiar landmarks, the timing of sounds, and even the intentions of other people. These predictions allow for smooth, coordinated action and rapid response to unexpected events. They also shape your sense of agency. The moment a predicted outcome occurs, it aligns with your expectations, reinforcing the feeling that you are in control. When predictions fail, you experience surprise or uncertainty, and your sense of agency can momentarily waver. In this way, the predictive brain underlies both the fluidity of experience and the illusion of free will, embedding subjective choice within a framework of anticipation and error correction. The anticipatory brain also accounts for the feeling of effort in decision-making. Complex or ambiguous situations require more elaborate predictive computations, simulating multiple scenarios, evaluating consequences, and integrating prior knowledge. The conscious mind interprets this computational work as deliberation, reflecting on options, weighing pros and cons, and eventually arriving at a decision. Yet the real work occurs beneath awareness. The brain generates, tests, and refines predictions long before the experience of deliberation arises. In simpler habitual contexts, the predictive apparatus can select actions almost automatically, giving the impression of effortless choice. The richness of conscious decision-making is therefore a reflection of the brain's predictive complexity, not an indicator of a separate, freely choosing self. The feeling of choice is inseparable from the underlying computations that produce it, revealing that what we experience as volition is deeply intertwined with predictive processing. Understanding the brain as a prediction engine also reframes how we think about responsibility and agency. If actions emerge from anticipatory networks rather than conscious initiation, our intuitions about control must be reconsidered. We may feel that we freely choose, yet the mechanisms generating behavior are largely unconscious, shaped by prior experiences, internal states, and environmental context. Nevertheless, the predictive system is not deterministic in a simplistic sense. It operates probabilistically, weighing multiple possibilities and dynamically adjusting based on feedback. This allows for flexibility, learning, and adaptation. Even if the conscious sense of freedom is a constructed narrative, our perception of deciding is intimately linked to the brain's ability to forecast outcomes and prepare responses, illustrating how anticipation is fundamental to the experience of agency. The predictive nature of the brain extends to social cognition as well. When interacting with others, you are continuously forecasting their behavior, intentions, and reactions, often before they act. Your decisions are informed not only by internal states, but also by these predictions, guiding choices in ways that appear conscious and deliberate. The feeling of freely selecting words, gestures, or strategies emerges from this ongoing anticipatory process, blending personal inclinations with modeled expectations of others' responses. The brain's predictive capacities allow for coordination, empathy, and understanding, all while maintaining the subjective experience of voluntary decision-making. The mind experiences itself as an active chooser because prediction creates a coherent, continuous narrative of intentionality, even if the underlying processes are largely unconscious. Furthermore, prediction underlies the construction of the self. The brain continuously models not only the external environment, but also the internal one, forecasting emotional responses, physiological states, and cognitive patterns. These internal predictions inform expectations about what you will think, feel, and do next, creating a sense of continuity and authorship. The subjective experience of free will emerges within this framework. The brain presents anticipated outcomes as decisions, providing the narrative of an autonomous self navigating choices. This self-model is both functional and convincing, allowing for coherent behavior, adaptive learning, and meaningful interaction with the world. The sensation of deciding is thus inseparable from the brain's predictive architecture, a testament to the sophistication and subtlety of the mechanisms that generate conscious experience. By appreciating the brain as a prediction engine, we see that the subjective feeling of making a choice is deeply entwined with anticipatory processes. Consciousness interprets the outputs of neural computations, presenting them as deliberate, voluntary actions, while the underlying network has already prepared the trajectory of behavior. The sense of agency, the vivid experience of choosing, and the perceived freedom of will are all emergent properties of this anticipatory machinery, giving the impression that decisions arise from a self when, in fact, they emerge from predictive networks that constantly model the world and generate outcomes in advance. The illusion of control is one of the most compelling and persistent aspects of human experience. Every day, we act as though our choices originate from a central autonomous self, a mind that consciously evaluates options, deliberates, and then freely selects a course of action. We hold ourselves responsible for our decisions, celebrate achievements as products of effort and intention, and experience regret when outcomes do not align with our expectations. Yet, when we examine the processes underlying these experiences, it becomes evident that the sense of control we so deeply trust is a carefully constructed narrative, a product of the brain's predictive and interpretive machinery rather than a reflection of some independent, freely acting will. This illusion is not merely a philosophical curiosity, it is central to how we understand ourselves, interact with the world, and structure our lives. The feeling of control is essential for functioning in complex environments, for planning, for social interaction, and for maintaining a coherent sense of self, yet it obscures the mechanisms that actually drive behavior. At the heart of this illusion is the way the brain integrates prediction, perception, and action. The brain does not wait passively for external events to dictate responses. It anticipates, prepares, and adjusts continuously. Neural activity associated with action begins long before the conscious awareness of deciding, creating a temporal gap between the preparation of an action and the subjective experience of choosing it. When we lift a hand, speak a word, or make a movement, the neural networks responsible for initiating these behaviors have already been active. Calculate, counting, probabilities, weighing outcomes, and committing to patterns of action before we are aware of our involvement. The conscious mind enters late in the process, interpreting and rationalizing what has already been set into motion. The result is a sense of control, a feeling that we are authoring our actions, when in fact the brain has largely orchestrated them unconsciously. This is not deception in a deliberate sense. It is a functional feature of consciousness, a narrative overlay that organizes behavior, aligns internal predictions with external feedback, and sustains the experience of being an intentional agent. The illusion of control is reinforced by the brain's remarkable ability to predict outcomes accurately, most of the time. When predictions succeed, actions align with expectations and the narrative of agency is strengthened. The brain presents the result as evidence of personal decision making, reinforcing the belief that conscious choice is the driver of behavior. When actions produce the expected outcome, we interpret this as confirmation of our competence, autonomy, and control. Even though the underlying mechanisms are largely unconscious, the match between prediction and experience bolsters the sense that we are free agents making deliberate decisions. The sensation of control feels real because it corresponds to a functional alignment between the brain's anticipatory activity and the unfolding environment, giving coherence to behavior and perception alike. The persistence of this illusion is also tied to cognitive biases and the way we construct causal narratives. Humans are storytellers by nature. We interpret events in terms of cause and effect, assigning responsibility to agents for outcomes that align with our understanding of intentional action. This narrative tendency magnifies the sense of control, as we assume that because we intended or predicted something, we caused it. Even when outcomes are largely determined by unconscious processes, chance, or external factors, our minds frame them as products of deliberate choice. This framing allows us to navigate complex social and physical environments by reinforcing the belief that our actions have predictable consequences, even if, in truth, many factors contributing to behavior lie outside conscious control. The illusion of control is adaptive because it fosters learning, accountability, and coordinated action, despite obscuring the underlying mechanics. Consider the experience of decision making in daily life. When you decide what to eat, which route to take, or how to respond to a question, the brain evaluates numerous factors, habits, sensory cues, memories, social expectations, and predicted outcomes long before you are aware of deliberating. By the time the conscious sense of choosing arises, the decision is already largely determined by these integrated computations. Yet it feels as though you are actively weighing options, exercising judgment, and exerting willpower. This temporal disjunction between brain activity and conscious awareness creates the foundation for the illusion of control. The feeling of choosing is real, but its origins are misattributed to a conscious self, rather than the distributed, predictive processes of the brain. The subjective experience of control is thus less about initiating action and more about interpreting and integrating pre-existing neural dynamics into a coherent narrative of agency. The illusion of control also plays a crucial role in motivation and self-regulation. When we feel that our actions matter, that we can influence outcomes, we are more likely to engage, persevere, and pursue goals. The brain leverages the narrative of control to support adaptive behavior, encouraging exploration, planning, and effortful action. Even if decisions are determined by underlying predictive processes, the perception of control energizes behavior and promotes problem solving. Without this perception, the motivational structures that sustain complex, goal-directed action would be weakened. The feeling of control, therefore, is not merely a passive illusion. It is an active component of cognition that shapes how we engage with the world, reinforcing behaviors that align with both biological imperatives and social expectations. This illusion extends beyond individual action to social and moral domains. Responsibility, accountability, and ethical evaluation all presuppose that agents possess control over their actions. When someone performs an action that aligns with social norms, we praise them as capable, deliberate, and autonomous. When they violate expectations, we judge them as negligent or culpable. These assessments rely on the experience of agency, the belief that individuals can freely choose to act differently. Yet neuroscience reveals that much of what we attribute to conscious control is orchestrated by unconscious processes, predicting and preparing behavior in ways that escape introspection. The illusion of control allows social systems to function, reinforcing norms, guiding cooperation and stabilizing interactions, even as it must the underlying mechanistic nature of decision-making. Even self-reflection and introspection are shaped by the illusion of control. When we evaluate past choices, we reconstruct narratives that highlight intentionality, reasoning, and deliberate action. We imagine that the self that decided then is the same self that experiences the memory now, reinforcing continuity and coherence in identity. This reflective process strengthens the perception that our decisions are consciously authored and freely made. Yet, as with immediate actions, the underlying processes are predictive, distributed, and largely unconscious. Memory, emotion, and pattern recognition all contribute to the reconstruction of choice, creating the sense that we were in full control, even when the outcome was shaped by processes outside awareness. The brain constructs a seamless story of agency, integrating perception, prediction, and reflection into a compelling experience of deliberate control. Furthermore, the illusion of control is heightened in contexts where prediction is reliable or outcomes are familiar. When navigating a familiar environment, performing practice tasks, or following habitual routines, the brain's anticipatory machinery operates with high accuracy. The alignment between expectation and outcome reinforces the sense of control, making actions feel effortless, deliberate, and fully willed. In contrast, uncertainty, novelty, or unpredictable situations can disrupt the sense of control, producing surprise, hesitation, or the recognition that outcomes are influenced by factors beyond conscious choice. These variations illustrate that the perception of control is not absolute but contingent on the successful functioning of predictive processes and the coherence of the self model generated by the brain. Ultimately, the illusion of control reflects the brain's remarkable ability to create coherence, stability, and agency out of complex, dynamic, and often opaque processes. Consciousness experiences this orchestration as free will, as the ability to choose, even when the computational machinery of the mind has already determined action. The brain's predictive and integrative mechanisms craft a narrative in which the self is both actor and observer, shaping the story of choice while remaining largely unaware of its own orchestration. This narrative allows humans to navigate the world with confidence, plan for the future, coordinate socially, and maintain a continuous sense of identity, all while masking the intricate neural processes that quietly guide behavior, generate outcomes, and underpin the experience of control. Responsibility and identity are concepts deeply intertwined with the sense of free will, Yet they are profoundly affected by the understanding that what we experience as conscious choice is largely shaped by underlying neural processes. From early childhood, we are taught to take responsibility for our actions, to evaluate consequences, and to learn from mistakes. Society functions on the assumption that individuals are autonomous agents capable of deciding between right and wrong. This assumption underlies moral, legal, and social systems, reinforcing the connection between action and accountability. Yet, when we examine the mechanics of decision-making, it becomes clear that the sense of control, the feeling that we freely choose, is a constructed narrative. Decisions are generated through a complex interplay of predictive neural networks, prior experience, habit, and environmental influence, with conscious awareness often arriving after the brain has prepared the course of action. Responsibility, then, is less a reflection of independent volition and more a product of how the brain interprets and represents its own processes in a manner that supports social and personal coherence. The tension between perceived autonomy and the mechanistic nature of decision-making has profound implications for how we understand identity. The self is experienced as a continuous agent, a coherent entity navigating the world and making choices according to preferences, beliefs, and values. Yet this continuity is itself a construction. The brain continuously generates models not only of the external environment, but also of the self, integrating past experiences, current states, and anticipated futures. Within this predictive framework, the self is a dynamic pattern rather than a fixed entity, and choices are generated by networks that simulate potential actions and their consequences. The conscious experience of deciding is woven into this model, giving the impression that identity and volition are inseparable, when in reality both emerge from the same underlying neural computations. Responsibility, therefore, can be reframed as a mechanism arising from the brain's need for coherence and predictability, rather than proof of a metaphysical freedom. The perception that we are accountable for actions serves multiple adaptive purposes. It encourages learning from mistakes, guides behavior towards socially acceptable norms, and enables coordination with others in complex social environments. When you feel responsible for an outcome, you are reinforcing the internal predictive models that shape future behavior, aligning expectations with actions. The experience of responsibility strengthens the sense of agency, creating a feedback loop where the brain uses the narrative of accountability to fine-tune predictions, prepare responses, and maintain the coherence of self over time. Even if the decision was largely predetermined by unconscious processes, the brain presents it as chosen to support adaptive functioning. Identity itself is inseparable from the sense of agency, yet it is also a product of predictive processes. The self is not a static entity making decisions. It is a continually updated model, anticipating how one will act, feel, and respond across contexts. Memory, expectation, and prediction converge to create the narrative of a stable self, one that appears to guide choices deliberately. The feeling that you are responsible for your actions reinforces this narrative, allowing for moral reflection, personal growth, and social interaction. When choices align with personal values, the sense of identity is strengthened. When actions conflict with those values, we experience cognitive dissonance, regret, or guilt. These experiences are essential for learning and adaptation, yet they emerge not from an independent, but from the brain's ongoing simulation and interpretation of internal and external states. The narrative of responsibility integrates the sense of agency into identity, making the construction feel real and continuous. Moral responsibility is particularly affected by this understanding. Traditional notions of morality presuppose autonomous decision-making, that individuals could have acted otherwise and therefore bear praise or blame. Neuroscientific insights challenge the simplicity of this view, revealing that choices are generated by processes that operate beyond conscious control. The brain integrates multiple streams of information, habitual tendencies, emotional responses, learned heuristics, and environmental context to produce behavior. Conscious awareness interprets this behavior as chosen, reinforcing the sense of moral agency. From a functional perspective, Moral responsibility is adaptive because it promotes social cohesion, guides learning, and encourages pro-social behavior. It relies on the experience of control, even if that control is an emergent narrative rather than a metaphysical property. Responsibility, then, is both a social construct and a reflection of the brain's interpretive capacity, a mechanism for navigating the complexities of human interaction and self-development. The interplay between responsibility and identity also extends to the experience of regret and self-reflection. When we perceive that we have made a poor choice, we experience discomfort, analyze contributing factors, and consider alternative actions. These processes support learning and adjustment, reinforcing predictive models for future behavior. Even though the underlying mechanisms are largely unconscious, the conscious experience of evaluating one's own decisions shapes future choices. Regret is not evidence of a freely acting self. It is the product of a brain that interprets its own predictions, aligns them with outcomes, and adjusts the internal model to improve accuracy and coherence. The integration of past behavior into a narrative of responsibility maintains continuity and identity, ensuring that the self remains stable and capable of adaptive action over time. Social identity is equally influenced by the brain's construction of agency and responsibility. The way we present ourselves, conform to norms, and respond to expectations depends on the predictive modeling of how others will perceive and react to our actions. The experience of control reinforces the perception that we are autonomous actors shaping interactions in ways that maintain social harmony. In this sense, responsibility is both internal and external. The brain constructs a sense of accountability to oneself and anticipates accountability to others, creating a coherent self-narrative that guides behavior within social contexts. The sense of identity emerges from the intersection of these internal predictions and external feedback, giving the impression that choices reflect a stable, independent self, even though they are continuously generated by dynamic neural processes. Understanding responsibility and identity as emergent properties of predictive brain processes does not negate personal significance or social function. On the contrary, it deepens our appreciation of human behavior. Recognizing that decisions are produced by complex, unconscious networks allows us to approach ourselves and others with greater nuance and empathy. It provides insight into why people behave consistently with patterns shaped by biology, experience, and context, while still appearing to exercise conscious choice. The sense of responsibility becomes a tool for guiding behavior, aligning expectations with action, and maintaining the coherence of self rather than proof of an independent will. Identity, in turn, is strengthened not by freedom from causation, but by the brain's capacity to integrate predictions, outcomes, and experiences into a coherent narrative of agency, enabling personal development, moral reasoning, and social engagement. The dynamic nature of identity also explains why our sense of responsibility can evolve over time. As we acquire new experiences, knowledge, and perspectives, the predictive models that underlie decision-making are updated, producing changes in behavior and self-perception. This continuous adjustment maintains a coherent narrative of self while allowing for growth, learning, and adaptation. The brain interprets these adjustments as evidence of autonomous choice, reinforcing the sense that identity and responsibility are linked to conscious decision-making. Yet these are emergent properties of predictive networks that shape, guide, and constrain behavior in ways that the conscious mind experiences as freedom, control, and moral accountability. In this framework, the self is not a singular entity that decides but a continuously evolving model, integrating predictions, expectations, and outcomes into a narrative that supports coherent functioning. Responsibility is experienced because the brain interprets and evaluates its own processes, generating a sense of accountability that is functional for learning and social coordination. Identity is sustained because predictive modeling provides continuity, allowing experiences, actions, and outcomes to cohere into a stable sense of self. The feeling of making choices, the judgment of right and wrong, and the perception of personal accountability are all emergent properties of the same underlying predictive architecture that generates behavior, illustrating that what we consider to be free will is deeply intertwined with the brain's capacity to construct coherent, adaptive models of both the world and the self. The realization that free will may be an illusion can be profoundly unsettling, yet it opens the door to a deeper understanding of what it means to be a conscious, thinking, feeling organism. To confront the idea that our sense of autonomy, the feeling that we freely choose, is largely a narrative constructed by predictive brain processes is to face the paradox of human experience. On one hand, life feels as though it is guided by conscious decisions, intentions, and moral reasoning. On the other, neuroscience reveals that these experiences are emergent properties of neural networks working beneath awareness, generating predictions, preparing actions, and shaping perception long before we feel involved. This tension can be disorienting because our entire sense of self, our conception of responsibility, and our understanding of the world are anchored in the assumption that we freely decide what to do. Yet the unsettling freedom that comes from accepting the mechanistic yet astonishingly flexible nature of the brain offers a more nuanced, profound, and ultimately liberating perspective. If our decisions are orchestrated by unconscious processes, yet experienced as conscious choice, then the freedom we experience is not the absence of constraint, but the emergent property of a system capable of generating coherent behavior in a complex, unpredictable environment. The brain constructs a narrative of agency to integrate perception, action, and expectation, giving the impression of self-directed control. This narrative serves multiple purposes. It supports learning, motivates adaptive behavior, and maintains the coherence of identity. Yet it is also profoundly enlightening to recognize that this sense of control is not fixed or absolute. The brain is continuously predicting, updating, and adjusting based on sensory input, experience, and context. Freedom, in this sense, is not metaphysical, but functional. It is the flexibility, adaptability, and predictive sophistication of the brain that allows humans to navigate uncertainty, explore possibilities, and engage creatively with the world. Understanding the brain as a predictive engine challenges the traditional notion of responsibility, yet it does not diminish moral significance. Actions arise from networks of neurons, integrating experience, emotion, context, and expectation. But the subjective experience of choice is inseparable from these processes. We perceive ourselves as deciding because the brain has evolved to present its computations in a coherent, interpretable narrative. The unsettling freedom lies in recognizing that moral accountability, creativity, and intention emerge from the same predictive architecture that generates behavior. We are simultaneously determined and dynamic, constrained by biology yet capable of adaptation, shaped by prior experience yet capable of generating novel responses. Accepting this paradox does not undermine ethical understanding, it reframes it, situating human responsibility within the context of a predictive, adaptive system that interprets its own processes as choices. This perspective also deepens the understanding of identity. The self is not a fixed, autonomous agent, but a model continuously constructed by the brain, integrating sensory information, memory, prediction, and social feedback. Our sense of who we are emerges from this ongoing modeling process, giving coherence to thought, action, and emotion. Identity, then, is less about independent authorship and more about the emergent patterns produced by complex neural dynamics. The unsettling realization is that the you, who feels in control, is not a singular originator of action, but the product of a predictive system interpreting itself. Yet this is not a diminution of selfhood. On the contrary, it highlights the remarkable sophistication of the brain, which can produce coherent, continuous experience, generate flexible behavior, and maintain a narrative of agency, even in the absence of absolute metaphysical freedom. The brain's predictive nature also reframes the concept of creativity. We often associate creativity with free choice, with the ability to imagine alternatives and produce original solutions. Yet the capacity to generate novel ideas is deeply rooted in the same predictive architecture that produces habitual behavior. The brain simulates possibilities, evaluates consequences, and integrates past experiences in order to generate outputs that feel innovative. Conscious awareness interprets these outputs as acts of autonomous choice, but they emerge from processes that are systematic, probabilistic, and context sensitive. The unsettling freedom here is liberating. It reveals that our capacity for originality, problem solving, and imagination does not require metaphysical free will. Creativity is an emergent property of a predictive, adaptive system that continuously models the world, experiments with possibilities, and integrates outcomes into a coherent narrative. Emotion and motivation are similarly shaped by predictive processes, contributing to the experience of agency and freedom. Desire, preference, and anticipation arise from complex networks that integrate internal states, past experience, and predicted outcomes. When we feel a choice is ours, when we feel motivated to act, this is the conscious interpretation of processes that have already been preparing, waiting, and selecting responses. The brain generates both the subjective feeling of wanting and the behavior that satisfies it. This duality creates the unsettling awareness that our emotions and desires are both ours and not entirely ours, products of a system that predicts and shapes behavior even as it presents itself as a freely acting agent. The richness of human experience, the ebb and flow of hope, fear, joy, and sorrow is therefore inseparable from the predictive mechanisms that create the narrative of selfhood, agency, and freedom. Confronting the illusion of free will also allows for a more compassionate understanding of human behavior. Recognizing that choices emerge from networks shaped by biology, experience, and environment can reduce harsh judgment of self and others without negating accountability. We understand that behavior is constrained and influenced by factors beyond conscious awareness. Yet the brain constructs the experience of choice, allowing learning, adaptation, and moral engagement. This perspective encourages reflection, insight, and empathy, revealing that freedom is not the absence of causation, but the emergent capacity to navigate, anticipate, and respond to a complex world. The unsettling realization that you are not the independent originator of action becomes a doorway to a richer appreciation of the mind's architecture and the subtle interplay of determinism and flexibility that underpins human life. The unsettling freedom also intersects with the experience of temporality. Consciousness experiences the present as a sequence of choices, yet these choices are continuously informed by past experience and future prediction. The brain constructs a narrative linking what has happened, what is happening, and what might happen, generating the perception of self-directed action within this temporal continuum. The now, in which we feel free, is thus the product of ongoing predictive computation. Recognizing this challenges the intuitive sense of autonomy, yet it also highlights the elegance of the brain's design. It integrates time, memory, expectation, and perception to produce coherent behavior and the sense of continuous agency. Our experience of freedom, while illusory in the metaphysical sense, is real in its functional, adaptive, and phenomenological dimensions. Finally, embracing the unsettling freedom inherent in the predictive brain reframes the meaning of choice. Choices are not meaningless simply because they are generated by unconscious processes. They are the culmination of a sophisticated, adaptive system capable of navigating uncertainty, integrating information, and producing coherent, goal-directed behavior. The brain's narrative of agency allows us to experience these outcomes as our own, sustaining motivation, identity, and moral reasoning. By understanding that free will is constructed rather than absolute, we gain insight into the subtle, elegant, and powerful mechanisms that produce human experience. This awareness does not diminish life's significance. It enriches it, revealing the depth and complexity of the processes that make perception, action, identity, and creativity possible, and showing that the freedom we experience is a reflection of the astonishing adaptability and predictive sophistication of the living brain.